Very good. Well, good evening, everybody. I think we should start. Time is pressing. I'm Alan Short. I'm the president of Clare Hall, and a very, very warm welcome to the 2025 Tanner Lecture on Human Values in Cambridge, to our in-person audience, and to the many college life members and others watching through Zoom around the world. And I need to say that if the fire alarm goes off, it will be a real alarm, and the Zoomers in can watch we live attendees flee obediently and expeditiously into Robinson's beautiful gardens. As we gather for this evening's Tanner Lecture and the Tanner Founders Lecture, which we know as the Ashby Lecture in memory of Lord Ashby, Master of Clare, Vice-Chancellor, our creator, we remember the Right Reverend Carolyn Tanner Irish, who sadly passed away in June 2021, Chair of the Tanner Lectures Board and daughter of the founder, Obert C. Tanner. But we're delighted that her son, Stephen Tanner Irish, who's assumed the chair, visited us only 2 weeks ago and is now watching this event remotely. And Stephen, you are, of course, most welcome, and we do hope that we'll see you again soon in Clare Hall. Well, Clare Hall is very privileged indeed to have been nominated to host the Tanner Lectures at Cambridge University, since that honour was bestowed by the signing of the trust deed by Obert Tanner and Lord Ashby in July 1978, prior to the delivery of the first ever Tanner Lecture, which was held here, not in the Ivy League, the purpose of the lectures being to advance scholarly and scientific learning in the field of human values. Tanner Lectures are now held annually at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Berkeley, Stanford, Utah, the Tanner home base, Michigan, and Oxford. This evening, we've gathered all the firepower available for 2025 through holding both Tanner Lectures on the same evening, with the Tanner Foundation's full blessing, which has enabled us to host a truly significant airing of the many difficult and confusing issues surrounding our future relations with the People's Republic of China. We are really, really delighted that Professor Li Daokui, the Mansfield Freeman Chair Professor in the Department of Finance at Tsinghua University, one of the most important economists in China, has come especially to deliver the 2025 Ashby Lecture tonight. You're hugely welcome, David. But first, it's our huge pleasure to invite Professor Rana to deliver the 2025 Tanner Lecture for Cambridge. We know that both speakers have been in deep discussion with each other as the day approached. Rana is a distinguished alumnus of King's College, former president of the Cambridge Union Society, from which he graduated as a Kennedy Scholar at Harvard. He's returned to Harvard in triumph as the newly appointed St. Lee Chair in US-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. And he was, until last summer, professor of the history and politics of modern China at Oxford and director of the University of Oxford China Centre. He's a fellow of St. Cross, our sister college in Oxford, with whom we enjoy very warm relations, not least between our student bodies, and was indeed its acting president until last August. He publishes on the political and cultural history of 20th century China. His interests include the Republican period, the Cold War, and Sino-Japanese relations. His publications include The Manchurian Myth, Nationalism, Resistance and Collaboration in Modern China, and A Bitter Revolution, China's Struggle with the Modern World, for which he was named Young Academic Author of the Year by the Times Higher Education Supplement 20 years ago in 2005. And Rana, you must have been 12 when that honor was bestowed on you. And Modern China, a very short introduction. He also presents and contributes regularly to programs on BBC television and radio, the North Atlantic being no part to that. So we're going to save all the questions until both of our guests have delivered their lectures, and we've allowed a good amount of time for those. So Rana, we hugely look forward to your lecture.
Alan, thank you very much indeed. And I'm just checking I can be heard at the back there. Yes, I'm getting thumbs up from the peanut gallery over on that side. So glad to see that it's coming through. I don't want to spend too much time at the beginning on courtesies, but I think there are just a couple of words I'd like to say before we start this evening's double-headed program and discussion. I'd also like to thank the Tanner Foundation. I'm delighted there are members of the family tuning in tonight. The lectures over the years have become a focal point for the exploration of human values, and I think there are actually few honours in the academic world that I personally have felt more deeply than being asked to speak in this particular series. I think that that idea of human values is also one that at a moment when the commonality between China and the Western and wider world is something that we think need more than ever to think about, that this is a particularly apposite moment for a program on China to enter the Tanner series. I'd also like, if I may briefly, to thank the President, Alan Short, here at Robinson and also at Clare Hall, in terms of bringing together this wonderful program, and everyone else from the college team, amongst them Johnny Cornwell, Francis Davis, Lewis Sheridan, Hilal Opal, and many others I know who've been involved in bringing this set of events together. And also to say my great pleasure and the honor that I feel in being in a double act with Professor David Lee Daokui. Although I have to say, as ever with such double acts, I think we're saving the best for last, but I will do my best to warm up where we are going. There are so many wonderful guests here who've taken the time to come here. I won't, if I may, individually name you all on this occasion, but I know how busy you are and appreciate that you've come to hear David and me and to join the discussion. But I will name two people, if I may, who I'm delighted to have here. One is my old academic advisor, Professor Hans van der Ven of the faculty. I am getting on enough to remember being tutored by Hans when he was the young, up-and-coming, dashing, young academic pioneer of what was then the Oriental Studies faculty. And of course, he still very much is, so nothing has changed there on that front. And I'd also like to mention a former junior research fellow at Clare Hall between 1970 and 74, my father, Partha Mitter, who is over there. As a result of his appointment as a JRF at Clare Hall, not only did he start a highly distinguished academic career, but it enabled me to grow up partly in the sandpit that used to exist just over the way as part of the fellows provisions for children at Clare Hall, presumably so that they could get away and write books while the younger generation made sandcastles and other highly productive gestures of that sort. So my gratitude to Clare Hall for what happened more than half a century ago, as well, I think, as his. I don't think there has been a more crucial moment for the relationship between China and the West in the past half century. And that's also true, I think, for the relationship between China and the wider world. And the reason I specify that is that the international order, as I think we all know, which has been fragile at best for the last 2 decades, certainly since the financial crisis of 2008, and perhaps even before that, with the upheavals after 9/11. It now gives the appearance, a little like the famous line from Ernest Hemingway about how a bankruptcy happened, which was that it happened gradually and then suddenly. So the collapse of many of the norms and expectations that we had about international order have also been overturned in just the past few weeks. And yet, nobody that I know of, whether inside China or outside it, doubts that China will be a central part of whatever happens when that order is reformed. There's little consensus, I would say, at the moment on what that reformed order might look like. I think we're still very much in the process of historical change, which as a historian, I find academically very exciting, but more than a little uncomfortable to live through in real time. But in terms of predicting where China may go, and to some extent that's what I'd like to try and do in the 40 minutes or so that I have before me today for the Tanner lecture. In terms of predicting where China might go, there's one fairly solid rule of thumb that applies to most of the last century. Whatever extrapolation you try and make about where China will be in 20 years from now, you will almost certainly get it wrong. In 1900, when the scene at the top of the second column there, the Dowager Empress Cixi was surrounded by members of foreigners and other members of her court, I don't think most people would have guessed that in 20 years from that time, China would be a highly fragile republic, which is essentially torn apart by militarist leaders. In the 1940s, when this particular central moment took place, and those of you who are historically informed or have been taught by Hans, which of course amounts to the same thing, will know that this is of course a seminal moment in World War II, when then Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi, and Su Meiling, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, met together with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill at the conference at Cairo in November 1943 on the future of Asia during World War II. I doubt that many people sitting in that place in Cairo at that time would have guessed that less than 20 years later, the scene on the left would have, in a sense, come and gone. The decade of Sino-Soviet cooperation, not with the America of Franklin D. Roosevelt and his successors, but of course, the Soviet Union of Stalin, which then, of course, would fall apart in acrimony in 1960 when the two essentially broke up, and paving the way instead for the Cultural Revolution and the ultimate era of reform and opening. And just to fast forward, again, at this moment, 11th of November 2001 in Doha, where, as you can see, slightly cut off at the top, a ceremony on China's accession to the World Trade Organization took place. Very few people, I think, at that point, on the Chinese or the American side, signing that agreement, would have known that in 2 decades from there, China would be engaged in a major trade war with the United States, one which, of course, is still, in some ways, still in formation 5 years on. So even though I think I've demonstratively proved that historians trying to predict the future 20 years on about China is an entirely foolish exercise, I will nonetheless attempt to undertake that exercise during the course of the next half hour or so. And I think that despite the difficulties of predictions that go wrong, they do have their uses, not least in allowing us to understand what we might better see in the future. After all, in 20 years from now, it's possible that Xi Jinping may still be in power in China, like Deng Xiaoping, who managed to retain some significant influence into his 90s. It's not impossible that that might be the case. But even so, leaving aside personalities, there is no doubt at all, in my mind, that in 20 years from now, China will be transformed much more significantly by factors including surveillance technology, climate change, energy transition, and of course, a demographic shift towards a much older population. And the 20-year intervals that I pointed out here, or 20 or 40 in some year intervals, although they show spectacular change over the decades, actually conceal what I think are wider and in some ways more important continuities and trends. And the trends are important because they underpin a question that's hard to ask, even harder to answer in the current fraught geopolitical moment, but may be one of the most important questions of the next quarter century and beyond. Is there a plausible version of China that the Western world and the wider non-Chinese world can coexist with in stability? Now, what are the boundaries? What are the framings with which I'm going to try and ask and answer that question today? Well, first of all, I would suggest strongly actually, that the trends of the next 2 decades suggest that there is almost no likely way that China can end up in a substantial military or geoeconomic confrontation and achieve its other aims. So in other words, trade wars, tariff wars, or any other sort of war, to use the phrasing of the Chinese Foreign Ministry last week, are not actually going to get China to the goals that it seeks to achieve. China cannot expand military activity and still attain economic security because demographics and greater economic integration and vulnerability make it much harder to run an autarkic economy, which will be the near inevitable outcome of a more confrontational regional and global posture. So I think first of all, that would be deeply unproductive, and secondly, for those reasons of outcome, would actually be unlikely. But absent conflict, which people talk about, sometimes for good reason, but not always, I think, with the wider spectrum of consideration, absent conflict, China has a range of futures that I think will see its global influence grow significantly in ways that will cause the wider liberal world, if we can still use that phrasing, considerable discomfort, possibly even angst. And it's those possibilities that I think should give us pause for thought at this particular moment. So just to say at that point, again, some of the things that I think are very much at the heart of where China sees itself at the moment. It sees itself as having a geopolitical role with the aim of being a leading power in the Asia-Pacific region. It's possible actually that this may become more the case as the United States begins to concentrate on its own hemisphere, which is one trend that we've seen emerging even the last few weeks. But that's a different thing from influence, where China, I think, is looking for and in many ways has global influence, not just regional. Its economic role is perhaps the most obvious one in the present moment. Investment, including increases in foreign direct investment, increasing role as a financial power with all of the geoeconomic power that that brings with it. But nonetheless, we should not forget that military power is also a growing and important part of China's global portfolio, having now the second biggest armed forces and the second biggest defense budget in the world after the United States. Its soft power is still weak, although, as I will go on to suggest later on, there are tools that I think that China can and possibly may use to try and strengthen that level of international soft power. And all in all, a phrase which many of you will know, 综合国力, comprehensive national power, is the index of overall spheres of influence which China has been assiduously pursuing for some decades, and which still make the kind of scorecard that it chooses to use against the achievements of the United States and other countries that are seen as peer competitors or rivals. But in doing that, we have to remember that the China that emerges at the moment is one that is the product, as indeed are all societies, of a whole variety of much longer and historically informed wider framing forces. And although this is by no means a comprehensive listing, I think these four give us some indication of factors that have tended to influence the way in which China has shaped its geopolitical goals and missions. The influence of modern history, in particular the century, the so-called 百年国耻, the 100 years of humiliation between the mid-19th and mid-20th centuries, from the Opium Wars, which first saw Western imperialism smash open the doors of China during the Opium Wars and afterwards, to the titanic but destructive conflict of World War II, at the end of which, or technically I guess in 1943, China finally regained sovereignty after 101 years of what became known as unequal treaties. The second one has a longer history, but perhaps is the one that tends to be best known, the idea of the Communist Party's control being underpinned by economic legitimacy. And since we have one of the world's great China economists sitting here in front of me, I won't say too much more about that because Professor Daokui will give us a deeply expert account of how economic legitimacy and Chinese governance work together. But it does have a longer history, not least underpinned by the very turbulent economic history of China from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century. The third one is what I'm broadly calling pre-modern thought. This is sometimes sort of thumbnailed as Confucianism, and I think that that's a both slightly reductive and rather narrow interpretation of a much wider repertoire of pre-modern thought, but one which has been both drawn on and adopted and adapted in various ways by today's Chinese thinkers to try and analyze contemporary problems. And again, a little later I'll go on to say a bit more about that. And finally, fourth, but by no means least, Marxism-Leninism, the overall framing that has always been ideologically at the heart of the Communist Party and its modes of thinking. When Xi Jinping describes himself as a 21st century Marxist, I think for him, not that I've spoken to him directly, I hasten to add, but nonetheless, both parts of the formulation are important. The idea that 21st century means that it's a thought system that's been brought out of the era of class struggle into something more contemporary, but also the idea that Marxism is still a broad framework in which, at least analytically, the party wishes to maintain a great deal of significant weight. So in doing that, let us take two of those ideas from Chinese sources that I think have a framing value for understanding some of where China is now and where it's likely to go. And again, I've chosen a couple, and again, to the many China experts in the room, these will be very familiar, but I hope they're nonetheless worth bringing up at this point. I could have chosen half a dozen more, and I'm sure in discussion people will bring others in. But here we have a picture of Feng Guifen, one of the significant political thinkers of the mid-Qing dynasty, the mid-19th century. And he was responsible, well, let me go through both of these briefly, the two different ideas that I want to put forward that emerged to prominence in the mid-19th century, at a time of great crisis for China when it was being invaded from outside and beginning to crumble from inside. And the idea of Fuguoqiang being the rich country and strong army as an aspiration began to get a great deal of purchase amongst political thinkers in the China of the time. In that case, it was significantly filtered through the agency of Japan, where the equivalent phrasing, Fukoku Kyohei, became an underpinning idea for the Meiji Restoration, which brought Japan to very swift modernization during that period. But in turn, the phrase itself actually has a much longer origin, going way back to early Chinese writings of around a couple of thousand years before. In contrast, this phrasing, 中体习用, Chinese learning as essence, Western learning for practical use, is an expression, that's what Feng Guifen was originally responsible for, brought up something that was more a dilemma of the 19th century itself, the arrival with the violence of Western imperialism, also of new ideas, modernization, ways of regulating society, and bringing together the capacity to bring about a new and more globally suited type of modernization for a China that wished to regain its own sovereignty and push back against the imperial powers. In some ways, the ideas behind these two phrases that were used as part of the crisis of the Qing dynasty have remained constant across the century and a half since they first emerged at the decline of China's last imperial dynasty. And in some ways, the ideas have remained remarkably constant. After all, many other countries have decided that rich country is a great idea, but strong army is no longer suited to their international needs. Britain has found that as it has begun to move from being a great global empire to becoming a European middle power. Japan and Germany, of course, found that in the aftermath of defeat after 1945. The second idea, I think, also has plenty of contemporary resonance, and not just in China, which is the idea that cultures will sometimes find that even when modernity, particularly modernity as defined by the West, provide new ideas for technology or economy or society, that nonetheless the search for some sort of cultural authenticity needs to be achieved either to balance or to nuance that idea of material progress. The Qing dynasty ended a long time ago, in late 1911, early 1912. But the ideas and the debates surrounding the ideas of Fuguoqiangbing and Zhongti Xiyong did not end at that period. You can see these two dynamics emerging in all the very, on the surface, diverse forms of political thought that have shaped China during much of the intervening period. So you can see the argument around these terms reflected in the bristly Marxist nationalism that led Mao to try and sinify, in the phrase that's often used, Marxism. It also emerges in the way in which he fell out so spectacularly with Khrushchev, the Soviet leader in the 1950s, over whose socialism was superior. You can see these same dynamics and also these same doubts in the debate that captured the China of the 1990s, some 35 years ago, when questions were asked about whether Singapore might be a role model for a country, for China, Singapore being a country that would combine stable governance, a balance between consensus and coercion, and a non-Western sensibility that nonetheless led to widespread global admiration. It's been a long time since China's elites have looked to Singapore for inspiration, rather than perhaps the other way around, but 30 or 35 years ago, it was certainly a significant debate. And that debate and that tension is still very much visible today. The search for that rich country and the strong army is not new, but the present day is probably the first time in history, certainly the last couple of decades, in which China has had both the aspiration and the economic capacity to achieve it. The search for authenticity is also very visible. Since the 1980s, at least, a modernized version of Confucian culture has been nurtured by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, as a way to try and define something culturally authentic, separately from the idea of simply growing GDP or growing military capacity. And even that term, 综合国力, although it has a social science sheen about it, is a direct intellectual descendant of that Qing dynasty, 富国强兵. But today's global context has changed immeasurably. And today, projecting into a plausible future 2 decades away, so we're now talking about sometime into the mid-2040s, so that is where I would love to hear thoughts and opinions about projections forward. It seems to me that the rich country and the strong army may not be compatible in the mid-21st century in a way that was viable or even desirable in the mid-19th. Broadly, China can either develop its economy, and contemporary tales, and we'll hear Professor Li's take on this, but I think reports that China's economy is on a permanent downturn are exaggerated. There is a great deal of capacity and a great deal of innovation in the Chinese economy, and I think it will be very much the case that that economy begins to recover and find new ways to create growth in the near future. So I think tales of China's economic inefficiency are overstated, but I would say that China can either engage in irredentist adventurism, to use a good Marxist phrase, or it can pursue economic growth. It cannot sustainably sustain both over that period of time. Why? Because more of China's economic presence in the future is likely to be linked to its overseas presence. Its geo-economic model demands more supply chains, more export of foreign direct investment, and embedding in new markets. Of course, this will give China more influence, particularly at a time when traditional free trading powers are drawing in from the idea of free trade. But it will also make China less autarkic and also more vulnerable to its connections with the outside world. Now, China's territorial claims are well known, they're regional, but they're potentially globally disruptive, the Indian border, Taiwan, and the South China Seas. But I think that it's still unclear that there are any obvious ways in which China can step up its claims on those areas without provoking either major regional or indeed US reactions. So in bearing that in mind, I think it's worth noting that there are a whole variety of different scenarios, and I'll spend the rest of my time briefly going through them, that provide that long-term scenario for China that looks into the 2040s and 50s, which tries to get past the idea of an immediate conflict, which I think is relatively unlikely, to be honest, rather than looking at the long-term trends. So here are some of the ideas that I want to put before you as visions for that future. One is China as a state that retains its existing political system, but turns relatively more liberal. Another is China as a global ideological influencer. The third is China creating a military confrontation. The fourth is China as a green energy leader. And fifth is China as a leader of its own silo of intellectual property, particularly in the world of scientific collaboration. All of these scenarios are possible. They are not all equally likely. I think the future is likely to be that China will have a strong country, a rich country, or a strong army, or at best a strong army that is never tested. But I think for the West, a China whose global power is growing, but where there is no one obvious point of confrontation, will be a hard geopolitical problem to overcome. And sometimes I think the concentration on conflict above all is a way of avoiding a much harder set of questions, which I hope we'll address tonight. So let's turn to the first of those scenarios. Bear in mind that in a couple of decades from now, in the 2040s, young bureaucrats, cadres, members of the Communist Party who are in their 40s will be in the top leadership, assuming that the current pattern of reaching that top leadership in your 60s still continues. It may be that the current top leader, Xi Jinping, is still in charge, but he will be in his early 90s by that stage. As I say, Deng Xiaoping also managed to have some power during that period, but nonetheless, he would probably be the last leader, if he's still in charge, whose childhood, whose teenage years were primarily shaped by the Cultural Revolution. Instead, many of the remaining top leaders will not be people in their 90s, but people who grew up in the 1990s. And I think that that makes a very significant difference. That was a period when China's social media, just in its infancy at that time, was much more open than it is today. It's one where daring journalism was sometimes possible, and where there were real debates inside China about how politics might develop. So again, dating from a little from that period, 1988, many of you will know the classic Chinese television series, Hershang, River Elegy, a kind of liberal ode to the May 4th movement and its values, which was one of the most influential pieces of liberal thinking about Chinese political renewal, banned after 1989, of course. In the middle, you have there the Nanfang Zhoumo, the Southern Weekend, one of the most daring, relatively liberal Chinese newspapers, which undertook fantastically detailed investigative journalism in the 1990s and 2000s, a sign of how real investigative work could be done in China at that time. Below, you have a handshake between President Bill Clinton and then Secretary General and President Jiang Zemin. Some of you with long memories will remember that they met together and held a live debate on Chinese TV in 1998 on democracy and whether it was a good idea. I think it's fair to say that they didn't necessarily share views, but it was a sign that the US and Chinese leaders could come together and actually debate that subject openly at that time, live on Chinese national television. My point about all these things being that these are not underground, 地下, dissident types of publications or media productions. They were all produced within the system that exists today in the People's Republic of China, and given the right circumstances, they could certainly be produced again. Just for balance, I do give you on the right-hand side, some of you might remember 第三只眼看中国, looking at China through the third eye, one of the many increasingly nationalistic publications that emerged in China, along with 中国不高兴, China's annoyed, or China's ticked off, and various other 中国可以说不, China can say no. So the emergence of those sort of nationalistic publications in the 90s and 2000s was also a trend, but that other trend that coexisted and debated within it, within the Chinese system, not in opposition to it, was immensely important at that time. Now, in 20 years' time, I'm not suggesting that the generation who grew up with that much greater openness will necessarily revert exactly to the values of that time. But I do think the things that shaped them when they were in their teens, when they were watching Jiang Zemin and Bill Clinton debating on live TV and reading through the exposés in Southern Weekend, will have made some difference in terms of their assumptions about how the world is, just as those who grew up during the Cultural Revolution also perhaps came to conclusions about how chaos, luan, might be the single most dangerous thing that could overturn China. And I think that that change, that emergence of a different generation, could culminate in a realization that a China that is most effective in raising its reputation in the world will be one whose authoritarianism is softer than it is now. Bear in mind that authoritarianism is not necessarily a barrier to international influence. There are plenty of other countries out there today, more than perhaps in the recent past, whose politics have moved away from the liberal, much of the Middle East, Turkey, India, but nonetheless have become cooperative international actors in global society, even when their internal politics have moved in an illiberal direction. The perception that those countries do not seek to reshape the world order to suit themselves has in fact magnified their influence. And I think that that realization is one that may become more important to China as things emerge in an increasingly illiberal world. Now, let's be clear, would this softer authoritarianism be the long dreamed of by perhaps President Bill Clinton, pluralist democratic China? Almost certainly not. Rather, in a paradox, I think that China's global image is likely to be boosted, not dimmed, by the general global trend towards more authoritarian politics that seems likely to continue into the 2030s around the world. But China's greater comfort level with a less liberal world could paradoxically mean that it feels more comfortable in loosening things at home. We've seen past versions of this, the early 1980s and the late 1990s to early 2000s. Past performance is, of course, no guide to future, no guarantee of future outcome. but it can be a guide. Is that outcome the most likely scenario? Quite possibly not. Is it wildly unlikely or impossible? Certainly not. The proof is before you on the screen. But if that China feeling more comfortable with itself in a world that feels more comfortable for China, what can it do to sell itself? Well, I have to say that not all ideological ventures are necessarily equally successful. So Marx and Confucius, who I both mentioned as influences on Chinese ideology, have recently made an appearance on Hunan television, where this program, Marx meets Confucius, involved these two actors. I have to say the beards are particularly spectacular, and I have to say, I think entirely fake. Spend 5 episodes discussing where the two of them actually might have thought systems that are compatible with each other. This TV series, a sign that Chinese media consumers don't simply swallow everything they're told, did not necessarily receive a terribly warm welcome when it was shown on TV. But it was an example of a wider ideological phenomenon that is part of a very fierce and important set of debates more broadly in China today, which is, could the China of 20 years from now be one that embodies an ideology with global appeal? Can it manage to create a version of its own politics, as America managed to do during the Cold War? And I think that there is some significant space for a non-liberal society like China to make that attempt as the liberal world appears to be increasingly in retreat. How would it happen? Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that not all of China's ideological message would need to be internationalist, just a workable proportion of it. After all, if you think about many aspects of the American worldview, the view that perhaps has been most successful in terms of spreading values around the world in the last 50 or 60 years, there are many aspects of it, for instance, the right to bear firearms, which don't translate very well to the outside world. But that didn't stop American influence in general being a highly important ideological and values influencer throughout the last half century or so. And we have precedent there as well, inasmuch as 50 to 60 years ago, global Maoism found purchase in the streets of Paris, in the small villages of West Bengal, out in rural Peru in the 1980s and 1990s. Moments find their ideologies, and the answer will come to some extent if China manages to find that particular moment as well in the fast-changing world. Just as many global South countries have leapfrogged, you might say, from having no phones to cell phones without the landline phase, it may be the case that many countries go from authoritarian state to hybrid regime without any pit stop at liberal democracy. And if that's the case, then China's version of economic and social reform might be something that they find attractive. In doing so, I think that this is likely to be the selling point of most significance. You have here a solar farm, and this gives what all ideologies need, which is an economic base. I think that China is likely to push in hard on one substantial change in the next couple of decades, which is energy transition. And the opportunity now comes for China to portray itself as a global green energy leader in a way that will put it more at odds with the United States, also potentially some of its partners in the Middle East who are highly dependent on fossil fuel. And that is a story that will resonate more and more with the global South. It'll be portrayed not just as economic, but also as a moral case, which is one of the things that has to underpin a successful ideological venture. In Pakistan, in Nigeria, in Indonesia, there will be an increasing demand for a narrative that global South nations are victims of global North greed. The North likes to note that China is the biggest total emitter of carbon. The South notes instead that Western states tend to have the highest per capita emissions. And as the energy hunger manages to underpin the growing markets of the global South, it will, I think, be easier for China to formulate an ideology that pushes that need for growing consuming populations to have energy as one where individual rights can be downplayed in favor of the collective benefit of greater economic growth. Since so many of those countries are themselves vulnerable to climate change, there will be, I think, a ready-made audience for that sort of message. It is, after all, one of the rare scenarios where China can portray itself as providing a global public good, and it can link its own ideas of what you might call authoritarian welfarism, the idea of collective economic good over individual rights, to being something that is brought together with the moral imperatives of energy transition. Echoes there of the 1970s when gas-guzzling Western cars were contrasted with supposedly frugal, highly morally freighted term, cars from Japan. This, I think, is likely to be one of the biggest geoeconomic arguments of the next 2 decades, but it's also one that will enable a division between the 2 different energy worlds to be portrayed in highly moralistic terms, indeed, on both sides. Let me, with the few minutes I have left, just give you a little download on some of the other areas that will come together. So again, that's just a bit of a sign there from the growth in China's zero-emission electricity generation, but also the emissions amongst major economies, China and the US in particular, in terms of total fossil fuel. There is, of course, another side of China's growth in the world, which has been continuing to certainly catch the attention and concern much of the rest of the world, which is its growing military capability. And much of that, of course, surrounds the question of Taiwan and the potential for a military seizure of Taiwan. And we see here the increase in Chinese military spending, along, of course, with US and Russian military spending along this side. I'm not going to go into the details of such an operation. That's not my purpose here tonight. I would just say that a violent seizure of Taiwan is not, I think, by any means the most likely outcome, but it is not an impossible one, clearly, either. But at the same time, I think that although it might be technically possible to pull off, it would lead to a deeply negative outcome for China. Very few Asian actors, Japan aside, might intervene in a military confrontation, but the aftermaths would increase, first of all, increased nervousness about China's intention in regional maritime control of sea routes, and it would therefore lead lots of people to adapt to a whole range of obstacles to growth, rather than opportunities for expansion or integration. It would also push forward the message in the region that China was never able peacefully to persuade people it regards as compatriots on the island to join Greater China. And a China that cannot persuade, as opposed to force, a culturally similar territory to join it, will not be able to create much of a narrative about its role as a regional uniter. So I think any coercive scenario over Taiwan or the South China Sea becomes an obstacle to Chinese growth, not an enabler for it. It makes it much more difficult for the Western world to import from China, but it also makes it much harder for China to use exports or to grow, and it would lead to increasing militarization amongst other powers in the region. So in the next 2 decades, it's very unlikely, for political reasons, that China will abandon its claim on Taiwan, but it could make it easily less of a priority, as it did for more than half a century under Mao and his immediate successors. China has yet to come up with a plausible answer about how it would seek to get closer to Taiwan on peaceful grounds. That is a great challenge, I would suggest, for its leadership, and one well worth coming up with a suitable type of negotiation compared to what we see at the moment. And let me take the last point, which leads us, I think, to where China is much more likely to find genuine global influence in the next few decades and years. One trend in the current motivation towards decoupling in terms of economics and technology between much of the West and China is the emergence of China as a tech hub which has considerable autonomy from the United States. The emergence of DeepSeek, the AI chatbot, in recent weeks and months has shown that China has become highly effective at workarounds, even when it's denied some Western technologies. In other words, the denial that sometimes exists that China has its own very rich, innovative technological capacity is no longer going to be something that can be simply ignored. I think probably if things continue in the current trend, fewer Chinese will be studying science in the West in 15 to 20 years' time, and the relatively small number of foreigners from the global north who do so will also remain relatively limited. But China will still be a massive hub for STEM knowledge and research. And I think the big change is that growing global south economies will have a much greater role in shaping that field as they produce young, qualified people who want to go into the most important tech ecologies in the wider world. So here we see examples of MOUs signed on the left-hand side on a moon mission collaboration with the United Arab Emirates. At the top, Brazil, another country which has niche but very specific and worthwhile scientific development going in various areas, collaborating with China. And then below, we have Singapore as an example of one of the global hubs in which that kind of new science collaboration is likely to emerge much more strongly. By the 2030s, the global South economies could be the place with the most hybridity and interaction between the tech worlds of the West and of China, which may become increasingly separated from each other. And that could mean that it's Southeast Asia or Brazil or Singapore where some of the most important tech developments come to emerge. In other words, the best of two tech ecologies which may be hostile to each other, but which are both keen to attract neutral adherents. So let me finish with the final slide here and give you my final montage. And I ask here a question which perhaps I'll leave you with as one for the Q&A, which is, what can we learn from the future? We're always learning from the past. Let's learn from the future today. These future scenarios indicate just some of the things that make today's China the kind of society it is. It's a society which has huge financial and economic interests in Africa, bringing both development and also problems over issues such as debt, which Zambia has recently gone through. But nonetheless, the capacity to get past those and reinvent itself as a financial provider. It's a country that takes part in UN peacekeeping forces, as you see on the top left, but also one that has huge military capacity, that has the ability to dominate its own region and beyond as well. And it's also a country that has both a rich consumer and media society and one with immense numbers of cultural products, some of which deserve to be better known in the West. I'll give you an example here of Huangbiao, The Knockout, one of the big hit TV series in China today, which easily lives up to Breaking Bad, Line of Duty, or many of the other similar sorts of series that have been big hits on Western television in recent years. And they add up to the complexity that I think I'll leave you with that we need to be aware of, that China will remain a key geopolitical actor for decades to come. Any hope of China disappearing off the scene, I think, is entirely misplaced. So the liberal world needs to think a lot more about what its preferred outcome with China is. It needs to work out what is the version of China with which the West can coexist meaningfully. After all, it's perfectly possible to see other countries, I mentioned Turkey, India, in the next 20 years being countries that have illiberal governance at home, but stronger trade links with their own region, and no real interest in major military expansion. And meanwhile, China's key to increased influence is, I think, ironically, the one that so far it has not shown great skill at, a transparent and convincing sense that it does not seek to resolve issues overall through confrontation. China will have to wean itself from its current comfort zone of lurching between saccharine statements about its place in the global order, which then turn to harsh language and coercive trade and military tactics when other actors fail to agree with China's assessment of its own purposes as purely benign. These ideas work in a closed media environment at home. They have little global purchase, even amongst many countries that have some real sympathy with China's world view. But nonetheless, that China has a great many opportunities in front of it to seek that rich country and that strong army. It is an idea that is, I think, incompatible with using military power in Asia. But the liberal world will have to think about, if China is not a country with which there will be a military confrontation, as I say, I think it's unlikely and to be avoided, deeply to be avoided, what is it about the other scenarios that are tolerable or intolerable, and why is that the case? If the United States and China are basically able to understand that both countries will be major forces in the world for a great deal of time to come, and both need to spend time thinking about their own presentation in the world, as well as the way that they think about themselves at home, then we are heading towards what we need, a world in which they are both major actors in a fast-changing global order, and one which the rest of us in the wider world, not just in the West, but in the global South and beyond as well, not only can live with, but can learn to cooperate with, and we hope, develop a great deal of benefit and profit as well. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Very good. We're going to have an interval now of about 10 minutes. Absolutely. We need to be back in our seats in 10 minutes to hear the Ashby lecture.
Do your best to get it all in in time, but yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, yes, always try to sort of squeeze too much into a pint pot, but I hope
David Lee Daokui to deliver this year's Ashby Lecture. So Professor Lee Daokui is the Mansfield Freeman Chair Professor in the Department of Finance at Tsinghua University and was the founding dean of the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua and the truly magnificent Schwarzman College, created by the founder of Blackstone, Stephen Schwarzman. A founding student of his department, Professor Lee graduated to take a PhD in economics at Harvard. He was a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the People's Bank of China and a delegate to the Beijing People's Congress, and a member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Committee, the CPPCC, which he explains in his book is the equivalent of our House of Lords. He is now a member of the Global Agenda Councils and a rapporteur of the International Financial Institutions Reform Cluster of the Global Redesign Initiative, the GRI, of the World Economic Forum, based in Dallas. And you may know Professor Lee's latest book, China's Worldview, Demystifying China to Prevent Global Conflict. It's a really fascinating insight for Westerners. The Financial Times reviewer wrote, written in the vein of a tutorial for interested foreign observers, Lee's book seeks to explain how China really works, with chapters on the central government, local governments, corruption, the environment, and other aspects of the national polity, all of which makes us yet more interested in what Professor Lee will say tonight. So Professor Lee, David, we hugely look forward to your lecture.
Thank you, President Short. Thank you very much for your very generous introduction. And it's truly my honor to be here to give this tenor lecture. Okay, and it's also my tremendous honor to share the podium with Professor Mita, who delivered a very insightful speech just before me. Okay, it's always very difficult for an economist to speak after a historian. Okay, because we economists try to find patterns, and historians often say, "Oh, patterns never work." Okay, things will change in 20 years. Indeed, he was right. He was right. 40 years ago, when I was a kid in the countryside, I was sent to the countryside with my parents who suffered during the Cultural Revolution. I was, instead of playing sand castles, I was playing with mud. With mud, okay. Not in the wonderful neighborhood of Cambridge. I was truly in the Hunan province. I never dreamed about being able to attend university. Never, okay. But later on, very quickly, okay, 5 years after that, China resumed college entrance examination. And I was only good at one thing, okay, only one thing, taking exams, okay? So I was very fortunate to enter Tsinghua University, and later on, again, I took nationwide exams to go abroad, to study abroad. I was admitted to a university in the other Cambridge. Now, truly, I come back to the authentic Cambridge, okay? Very, very happy. Really, you're right, Rana, you're right. No, you're right. Nobody could predict her personal life, let alone the whole country. But today, I feel compelled to explain to a larger audience how China works and what will happen to the future of the world, as far as I can tell from inside. Because as an economist, I know I'm not the best person to explain this to the whole world. But in China, there are very few people who are either willing or able to explain. So I feel compelled to write this book. I spent 10 years writing this book, China's Worldview. And I missed all possible deadlines by my editor, okay? I really struggled, okay? But at the end, I finished this book. The reason, just like today I came here, I want to really explain to you what is China's worldview from inside and what are the implications of the China's worldview for the future of the world, okay? So first, we are facing a danger of global conflict. Just over 2 years ago, China's so-called China spy balloon was discovered 5 10 miles above the ground of Montana, the state of Montana, and where nuclear military bases are supposed to be spied upon. And then the balloons are so high, airplanes cannot even reach. So the whole American audience, the TV audience, are excited. For the first time, they feel that China is coming. The spy balloon is coming. And the TV hosts said, don't try to shoot the balloon with their rifle. In the US, they have rifles, right? The bullet will come down to you, okay? Because it's too high, okay? So really, we are in the times of potential crisis. I think the potential crisis all boils down to one question. That is whether China will replace today's USA, which is extremely very troubling question for many people in the world, especially in the US. In order to answer this question, I strongly believe an insider's view, a view from a person who lives in China, who participates in meetings with Chinese leaders, including our top leaders, who oftentimes attend various conferences in China, is needed. The insider's view is needed. So here I am trying to explain two critical questions. How does China work? And then, what is China's worldview? Based on these two things, maybe we can explain, of course, with danger of being, with a warning from a historian, okay, the future of the world. So first, how does China work? Okay, this book is now just 1 year ago. Let me tell you, I worry while writing this book mostly about potential translation in Chinese. I don't want this book to be translated into Chinese. I don't want to translate. I don't want people to know this book in China. Because when you translate into Chinese, which I did using machine, I used machine AI to translate it 5 years ago when I wrote this book. I was scared. Oh, all the language I use in English, translating back into Chinese, is scary. It's very scary to the Chinese authority, even the Chinese leaders. Okay, so anyway, so this book is the source of my today's talk. Okay, you're more than welcome to get a copy of this book. I signed a copy for President Short for you, okay? Later on, I'll give it to you, okay? Okay, so how does China work, okay? Number one, China, of course, China is ruled, is governed by a dominant party. The name is CCP, Chinese Communist Party. But China is not alone having a dominant party. Singapore has it. It's called PAP, People Action Party. This is the leadership, top leadership of the PAP after election. And Japan used to have it. It's called LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party. Of course, LDP did not win election about 20 years ago, no longer being dominant. And Mexico used to have it. It's called the Institutional Revolution Party. So China is not alone. However, China is unique because the name, Chinese Communist Party. So what's the meaning of communism? Okay, right. Rana explained this. Marxism combined with Confucianism. Wonderful explanation. Okay, let me give you another perspective. Okay, the name communist is in the party's name. It's not because what we understand by reading the manifesto of communists, the Communist Manifesto, is different. Communism or communist in the name of the Communist Party is mainly meant for nation building. Why? Or how was the party established? It was established when the whole nation was in chaos. A bunch of young people, 13 or 12 young people, young intellectual 20-year-olds, gathered together in the French enclave in Shanghai, and they established the CCP because they got inspiration from the Russian Revolution. They thought, oh, Russia can get strong by adopting communism. We can do it. We can do it. So it's history. So therefore, fast forward to 1990. In 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed. Poland started with Poland, East Germany, Romania, all these countries, all these former communist countries collapsed, right? So Jiang Zemin, the Secretary General, you showed his picture, now popular figure now in this lecture, okay? Jiang Zemin, then the Secretary General of Communist Party, seriously, very carefully, like a scholar. By the way, he's an engineer, electrical engineer, okay? With good training, okay? Very good English. He can cite the Lincoln's Gettysburg speech, okay? Better than Lincoln, better than Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton cannot do it. He can do it, okay? So he carefully, he conveyed a team of scholars studying the question whether we should drop the name communism or communist from the party's name. At that time, like a fellow economist called Fan Gang, I mean, I should not mention his name, but no, it's today's it's on TV, okay? Anyway, a famous fellow economist made a calculation. If we drop the name communist, we can save the whole country billions of dollars of tariff. Many countries will no longer treat us as a communist country, right? We can do free trade. So economists did the calculation. Anyway, so Jiang Zemin did a study. At the end of the study, this is the truth, okay? This is absolutely true, okay? It's well documented. I know the person who was involved in studying, in doing this study, whether the party should drop the name. The answer is no. We will not drop the name communist from our party's name. Why? In the words of Jiang Zemin, if we drop it, there are many people who will be disillusioned. History will have to be rewritten. China is a country respecting history. Rana, you will have tremendous respect in China. You're better respect in China than economists. Historians always well respected, right? We're a country of historians. I often joke, America is a country of sports. People talk about baseball. Okay, the UK, I don't think people talk about soccer all the time. The Americans often talk about baseball, right? We often talk about history. We use history to sometimes indirectly criticize today's politics. Okay, anyway, so on the right-hand side is a picture of the Central Party School, 2 miles away from my campus, or Tsinghua University campus. Central Party School sounds very fancy, right? Central Party School. Central Party School does two things. One is training government officials before being promoted. The other thing is to do political studies like this. A Central Party School did a careful study, and the conclusion was that don't change the name. Okay, and then the other feature of the CCP, other than the name, is the following. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is one of the very few parties, ruling parties in today's world, in having fought military warfares for 22 years, more than 2 decades, before assuming national power. The only nation, the only party, ruling party I can think of is Vietnamese Communist Party. Not even the Russian Communist Party. Lenin got it easy. Lenin, in comparison with China, Lenin got it easy before assuming national power. Lenin got it because due to a few military uprising in arsenals, or like soccer games, arsenal, you know? I don't know what proper explanation. Arsenal, factories making weapons. But China, 22 years. Why I mention this? A party which had to fight for 22 years and sacrificing millions of lives before assuming national power would be a party which treasures power very much. Very much. You would never give up power so easily. Also, a party having fought for 20 years of military warfare and then succeeded and then assumed national power must be a party which has to be adaptive. Otherwise, you lost. Otherwise, you wiped out. The worst thing in fighting a military warfare is dogmatic. Is to follow the book. You never follow the book. If you follow the book, you are wiped out because the enemy knows your strategy. The enemy will wipe you out. So Chinese Communist Party is very adaptive. What's the official, I don't know how to translate the English. Adapting with time, 与时俱进. What's the official 与时俱进? Changing with time. Changing with time. That's Jiang Zemin's word. 与时俱进, changing with time. So today, in our top leaders, I don't give you a name, okay? Top leaders' popular language, he wants to combine two combinations. One is combine Marxism with Confucianism. The other one is combine Marxism with Chinese practical situation, right? Two combinations, right? Anyway, there are many, many political codes, okay, codes that will only, it's hard to translate to English, okay. Anyway, the third feature of this party is, again, very important. It's grassrooted. With 1 million Communist Party members in every village, there is a committee of the Communist Party. Never in the Western countries. Can you think of the American Democrats having committee in every farmland? Never. Never in the world. Deeply rooted. This is a picture of the village Communist Party committee holding a meeting discussing their village affairs, helping poor people, so on and so forth. Okay, the other feature of the Communist Party you have to understand before you understand the whole Chinese future is that this party is having the world's most sophisticated HR department. HR, Human Resource Department. Let's do a case study. Xi Jinping came to power before assuming his current position after being deputy mayor of a small county, the mayor of the county, then deputy mayor of a larger city, and then party secretary of a larger city, and then deputy governor, then the top leader of a rich province, and then the top #1 guy of Shanghai, and then deputy president, vice president of the country, and then the president of the country. All steps, step by step. In comparison, Obama, to my best knowledge, his best ranked job before assuming senator, before being elected, was community worker. If you don't count a law school professor as a real job, okay? So Obama just helicopter going to White House. Same can be said about a current president of the US. His major experience is TV show. Before being a developer, I think he has more experience doing TV show than being a developer, right? And then becoming White House #1 in the White House. So that's his work experience. So in China, the HR department is very important, meaning that whoever in top decision-making position is very experienced. There are pros and cons. The good thing is that the person is cautious, practical. The downside is this person is unlikely to bring drastic changes, right? So I often joke, in China, we will never have Dr. Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger, before being the National Security Advisor, he was not even department head of Harvard Political Science Department. He was just, I think, maybe the director of CFRA, Center for International Affairs, CFIA affairs, right? So in China, his CV was incomplete. He would be disqualified to be the security advisor in the US. Okay, now the party is sophisticated. The party was meant for nation building. The party was not dogmatic. Then the second feature of how China works is the following: self-discipline. You may think, okay, self-discipline, wow, in the British political philosophy, it's oxymoron. How can you have power means corruption. Absolute power means absolute corruption. What's Lord Acton, right? Well, that's British, that's Western philosophy. I think no deny, it's truth. However, there are always exceptions. So let's talk about reality. In China, this party, the central party, CCP, does have self-discipline. In the case of PAP in Singapore, of course, they have election. Every election is a discipline. They have to serve the community. Otherwise, they would lose seats in the parliament. In China, how does it work? Number one, political thinking. As famous, as important as Confucius, Mencius is also important. Mencius argues that when you are in power, when you are running a country, the people are like the water. The water can either float your power. Meanwhile, if you're not careful, the water can also sink you, can also undermine the boat. So you have to be careful. You have to serve the people. Mencius' idea is people first. If the emperor does not behave, the people have rights to revolt against the emperor. That's Mencius' idea. Mencius is actually more progressive than Confucius. But this idea is deeply rooted in today's Communist Party, okay? Look at this. Let me give you an example, okay? On the left-hand side is Wen Jiabao. He was a premier, okay, during the global financial crisis. I was in the room when he announced the 4 trillion stimulus package. Do you remember that? China implemented the 4 trillion stimulus package. He was not, I should be careful, okay? He was cautious. He is cautious. He was very aggressive in putting out this 4 trillion stimulus package to go against the 2008 financial crisis. But let me tell you, today he's oftentimes blamed for being too aggressive, for being to have done excessively. Okay, so he's very concerned. In other words, in China, a leader, when making a decision, is always concerned about the history, how history would judge me. In contrast, George W. Bush, I had him as the very first guest when the Schwarzman College opened. He was very happy, he's a wonderful, truly he's a wonderful person, relaxed, joking, relaxed, happy. I'm happy for him. But I was thinking, look at this guy. He didn't do so well during his presidency. The global financial crisis, the Iraqi war, all these things could be blamed on him. But as historian, right? Historian would associate him with all these things. But he had light heart. I use this as an example to show you that Chinese leaders, even though they seem to have absolute power, they are burdened, they are paranoid, they are anxious, they are worried about history. They worry about how history would evaluate him. Or her, maybe, which actually be gender neutral, okay? Right? So that's the thing. That's the discipline, the burden of history. The burden of history. That's political tradition. Okay. The third thing special about China, about its self-discipline, is Mao Zedong's thinking. It's still relevant here. Everybody talks about this, Chinese leaders. Here's a picture of Mao Zedong going to Beijing. He was 10 miles outside Beijing, near Tsinghua University. He was taking a US-made Jeep, Jeep captured from the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, right? He was winning against the Chiang Kai-shek. He said, he said it to his comrades, let us step down from the Jeep. Let us walk to Beijing. Why? Because we are taking exams. If we are not careful, governing China will be failed. People will be our professors. They will fail us. So that's the mentality. That governing China is like it's like a good student taking exams, always on the toes, always worry about professor giving you tricky questions, always fail you. That's the mentality of Chinese top decision makers. Okay, now, self-discipline is also working in China through the way of the party discipline inspection committee. This is a picture of a government official. He was in the middle of a meeting. Then the party discipline inspection committee came in, like this lecture hall, come in front of the whole audience, was taken away. This is shocking. This is today's China. So people who are alleged, who are suspected of being corrupt are taken away, going through inspection. Every year, I count, at least on average, 5 ministers, ministerial level officials are under investigation. There are about 100, or maybe 150 ministers, minister level officials. This is for real, okay? So the third thing I want to mention about how China is governed is that this in China, the philosophy is the government is like parent, is like the parent, or like parents, responsible for everything. So people say, we give up some of our rights to you, but when we have trouble, we will go after you. This is a picture of the CSRC, Chinese Security Regulatory Commission, which is like in the UK, I forgot the name, you change a lot. In the US, called the SEC, Security Exchange Commission, in charge of stock. And in front of the Chinese CSRC, this is a real picture, protests. Why? Because these guys lost money in the stock market. They went to protest in front of CSRC, saying, you did not do a good job in regulating the stock issuing companies. We want our money back. Can you imagine that? In the UK, in London, London, when people lose money, they go to your parliament or go to 10 Downing Street to protest, get their money back. You failed us. Never, never. That's yours. That's your bad luck. That's, go home. That's you made the wrong decision, right? Okay, so that's China. Okay, and this is a picture of earthquake. Whenever there's earthquake, quickly. Whenever there are people, over 10 deaths, then it's national crisis. 10 is the magical number. Any events with 10 deaths, that the top leader was some people there. Okay, this is a picture of a special situation in China. You can never imagine. We have bureaus of letters and calls, which actually means, should be translated into Bureau of Grievance. If you have a grievance, if your land is taken away by village head, and we giving you a very little compensation, you go to the Bureau of Grievance. You send your letter. Sometimes they bite your finger, you use blood to sign the letter, okay? I got it every day, every week. Every week I get a letter from this. People, you used to be a member of the CPPCC, used to be a delegate in the Beijing People's Delegation. You have some power. We go to after you. This is the Chinese political culture. The government has to be careful. The government has to take care of people. That's why during the pandemic, we have much more stringent policies than UK. That's the mentality. Government officials believe they are responsible for the lives of people. Okay. Anyway, so that's the third feature. To summarize, dominant party, self-discipline within the party, and all responsible government. Well, how does China? Okay. So what's China's worldview? Okay. So again, in the book I summarized the 6. Here, let me shorten it. 3 relevant Chinese worldview for the future of the world. Number one is that finish homework before going out to parties, okay? Like I don't know, Cambridge culture. In the US, there are many campuses famous for party. It's called party universities, right? In the UK, you don't have this, right? You don't have this. Students are working hard here. Okay, anyway, so, but is this, what do you mean by this? I mean this, always the mentality. First make sure domestic affairs are properly taken care of before going to deal with international affairs. This is different from MEGA. MEGA, in my view, is the following, it works this way, okay? Me, President of the US, I go out. I'm asking for land from Greenland. I ask for port from Panama. I rename the Gulf of Mexico from Gulf of America to help me domestic politics. The Chinese is reversed. We take care of domestic affairs before talking about other issues. Okay, so MEGA. Here is another issue, another picture to show the mentality of finish homework before going to parties dealing with foreign leaders. These are the pictures of Chinese annual National People's Congress meeting and for every 5 years, the Communist Party Congress. During these meetings, no state affairs, no state visits. If you ever have any experience working for your foreign service, you would never get any arrangements of Chinese leaders coming out to meet your leaders during these meetings. No. When there are important domestic meetings, no more international visits. Okay, domestic affairs, much more important than international affairs. Also, in this picture, I show you the picture of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also the minister, today's incumbent Minister of Foreign Affairs. Let me tell you, the level, the bureaucratic level of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is much lower than the State Department of the US. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs is much lower than his counterpart, Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is number 3, number 4. What's number 4, number 5? Top 5 for sure, top 5, right? President, Vice President, the Secretary of, maybe the Treasury Secretary, maybe the Foreign Secretary of State. In the US, foreign affairs is important, not in China. Not in China, okay? Domestic work, more important, okay? Now, second, China's worldview is development is the absolute principle. This is Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping said, if we don't develop, we will be wiped out from the village, the global village. Will be wiped out. Development is job number 1, okay? Today, our top leader still says the same, right? He says high quality development is job number 1. It's the absolute principle, okay? So economic development is job number 1, okay? And it's a picture of our Chinese former premier signing economic deal with an incoming visiting African leader. So for Chinese diplomacy, economic deals always working, always there, okay? Now, and the third element of China's worldview is that respect-centered diplomacy. You may think the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a big project, supposed to be a big project helping many countries in building roads and industrial parks. You may think, oh, it is for the real interest of China. It is for solving China's excessive production capacity. It is for Chinese goods to be exported. It is for China to have more influence in Africa. Now, my view, my honest view, working in China and working with the government, my honest view is that you are not totally correct. The number 1 objective is to gain respect from African countries. Look at this picture. This picture is one of the is the summit in the 2017, the summit of the Belt and Road. Something around 50 top leaders from many countries all came to Beijing. They came to Beijing. The top guys, Rana, you must have watched the TV. I'm sure you know this. I'm sure the picture is planted in your head, right? The leaders would come to they would walk along long stairs. Well, Professor, President Short, you are architect. You know this, the Roman style, that big stairs, right? The foreign leaders walk up the stairs, right? And our top leader standing on top, and then shake hands. Picture, right? Respect. Respect-centered diplomacy is not necessary for real interest. If you count the actual economic benefit of BRI, it's hard. It's hard to calculate. Maybe it's big, maybe it's small. I don't want to get into debate, but I would argue this is tangible benefit. Respect-centered diplomacy. Now, among many things, you can criticize President Trump. President Trump can be bad in this, bad in that. But he did one thing right. He never personally attacked our Chinese top leader. He even, in one TV interview, which I double-checked, not AI, not fake. It's real interview. He said, Chinese leader, the tradition is better than any U.S. president. He said, is the best Hollywood movie actors cannot even pretend to be our Chinese top leader. So Trump did one thing right in terms of dealing with China. He had respect for the top leader in China. So that lays a foundation for further interactions. So Trump, I think at one stage announced that within the first 100 days, he will visit China. We will see. He missed many things, right? We will see, okay? Anyway, but I'm sure trying to get respect is a major objective of Chinese diplomacy, right? And this is a deeply planted. You know this better than many other Western countries. When your queen's envoy visiting Chinese emperor, he was struggling with one detail, whether he should knee, so the bend or put on his knee for Chinese emperor or not, right? That's not about actual detail. What UK wanted from Qing dynasty. That's the envoy. What envoy did behave in front of the emperor? Anyway, so that's important to keep in mind. Well, so what is the future? What is implication for the future of the world? Before talking about that, let me do a simple digression, which is important. Will China collapse? Are we wasting our time? Maybe what people say, oh, you're wasting your time, China will collapse. No, in 10 years, okay, we call regression to the mean, okay, to the middle. China will no longer be an important country. You are wasting your time, don't talk about China. No, apparently you disagree, right? You're coming here, you disagree. Let me give you a reason why you are not wrong, why I'm not wrong, why, Rana, you are not wrong, why talking about China is still important. Because I think all signs indicate China will keep on continue growing, continue rising. Why? Politically, as I said, it's a super cautious political regime. It's a grassrooted regime trying to solve community problems of the villagers, of the residents. It is a self-disciplined party. Economically, although there are many problems and not enough consumption, population aging, however, keep in mind the following 4 simple facts. Number 1, it is a high savings economy. More than 40% of GDP is put aside for saving. Savings is a good thing. Keynes was right. Too much saving in the short run is no good. But in the long run, in order for a country to grow, you have to have your savings. Saving is a source of investment. Without investment, you can never grow. Okay, saving is also a good thing to resolve historical mistakes. Okay, as I wouldn't go into detail in the question part, in the Q&A part, I'm happy to answer economic questions. Savings, high savings. 40% is among the world's highest. I think lower than Singapore. Singapore is higher. 40% is higher. Pakistan, 10%. India, by now, I think 25-30%, going up. US, I believe 17%, too low, okay. Number 2, economic R&D capacity. Second highest in the world in terms of, at current exchange rate, in terms of expenditure R&D. However, the purchasing power of the China's R&D expenditure is much higher than the US. Because engineers are much, I wouldn't use the word cheaper, it sounds, engineers are less expensive than American engineers. I learned English. I thank you for my English teacher. Cheap is better, is negative word. Inexpensive is good word. Okay. Okay. Anyway, so why? Because every year China generates 4.4 million college graduates in engineering, which is higher than the sum of the rest of the world. 4.4 million college, I triple check, trust me, okay, I triple check this number. 4.4 million college engineering students graduating. I was half trained as engineer at Tsinghua University. Engineers were much better trained than economists in China, than historians, okay, in China, okay. And R&D is keep on. No wonder China has DeepSeek, AI. No wonder China would have so much hardware. 70% of shipbuilding capacity is in China and still growing. U.S. talking about aircraft carrier. U.S., how much shipbuilding capacity U.S. has? 1% of the world. U.S. cannot build its own military or aircraft carrier. By the way, just keep on that. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. He talked about China. He talked about even Hong Kong. Of course, he didn't mention the name Hong Kong. You read it, why? No wonder UK wanted Hong Kong. Because he said, Adam Smith, a country, where is the richest part of a country? That part is many rivers going to the ocean. That part is the best. Wow. And when I read Adam Smith, I suddenly realized, no wonder Hong Kong was coveted by the UK. And also, Adam Smith mentioned, we want to liberalize everything, free market, except for one thing, shipbuilding. All countries doing international trade with the UK, or vice versa, I should put it this way, all UK companies doing international trade must use UK-built ships. He said that, check on paper. The reason is because if we don't do that, then other countries will make better ships. When other countries make better ships, they make better battleships. Adam Smith is extremely sophisticated, okay, extremely rich in message. It's not just, free market is good. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, wonderful, wonderful. It's really the Bible of economics, okay? Right, anyway, I digress, okay. So R&D, okay. Aging population, yes, but we're much healthier than before. Very active, people are working hard. People come in my room, decorating my room. I'm a fan of architect. I'm into, President Short, I'm into your business. I try often talk about construction. There are people older than I am. I'm over 60 years old. I was born in 63. There are many people my age doing construction work in China. They're still healthy. They're willing to work hard. So aging, yes, but still healthy overall, still active population. Of course, with AI coming to help, right? Labor is supposed to be in surplus, right? So not worry about aging, okay? Then finally, untapped, huge demand, 700 million population not enjoying modern lifestyle. They're working hard, of which 350 population are being assimilated into city life. They are not fully urbanized. So these are untapped demand, okay? Of course, all these are potentials, problems, challenges, economic challenges, they are there, okay? I will get into them in the Q&A if you want to ask. I have more complaints about economic problems than about potentials, okay? But for the time being, let's make sure we are right. China, overall, will continue rising. So we're discussing a real question rather than what is much busy about nothing. What's the Shakespeare? Much ado with much ado. Yeah, we are busy with important things. Okay, okay. Now, finally, what are the implications for the future of the world? Combining how does China work, China's worldview, and China keep on rising. There are three. I only know three. I try to make things simple, right? Three implications. Okay. First is that China will not export its ideology. China will not be able to interfere into other countries like today's US. Because China simply cannot easily explain itself easily. I'm serious. We are too complicated in our ideology. In Chinese, we have to remember codes 442. for political conscience, for self-confidence, and the 2 sense of, I don't even how to, we have a lot of political, ideological things. Even in Chinese, we have trouble memorizing them. So we use code 442. How can we explain it in English or other language? US, UK, simple. Democracy, human rights, human rights, democracy, equality. What else? What else? Equality. Freedom. Oh, what else? Less than 5. One palm, 5 fingers can cover your values. We are too complicated. Marxism, Confucianism, complicated, right? Okay, so look at this. The Korean leader does not listen to China. China oftentimes knows less than your intelligence about what's next move, right? Pakistan, supposed to be best friend of China, supposed to be, okay? All-weather friend of China. But does China interfere in Pakistan in choosing their prime minister? No way. Does China have military advisors based in Pakistan? No. No interference. I'm stating a fact. You can quadruple check your facts. Okay. Now, and also another example. This ANC, African National Congress, also treat Nelson Mandela, right? Used to be the head. Nelson Mandela used to hold Mao Zedong's Red Book. Mao Zedong was Nelson Mandela's hero. But does ANC send their cadres to Central Party School of China to get a training? Not to my knowledge. The Central Party School cannot teach the ANCs. They simply do not have enough faculty members being able to speak Chinese, speak English like me. Okay, they run out of human power to explain Chinese things to the rest of the world. So no way, China will not be able to export or interfere in other countries' affairs or export ideology. Second, yes, China were growing. Military hardware growing, airplane. The 6th generation airplane is now being already produced or showcased. Aircraft carriers being built. But China will be like Yao Ming, big size. But Shaquille O'Neal, do you watch basketball? Shaquille O'Neal, the powerful center, smaller than Yao Ming in height, but much more powerful than Yao Ming. Yao Ming is 7'3", Shaquille O'Neal 7'1". The 7'3" person bigger in size, but less powerful. Shaquille O'Neal, right, used to be a teammate of Kobe Bryant. This is American culture. Right? So I'm sorry, I don't know soccer enough, football enough. I should have used football. But sometimes bigger size doesn't mean you have power. This is perennial disparity, China. China will be bigger in military hardware, in many things, but however, not powerful. Okay, final implication. Romans, this is please feel free to criticize me, but this is this is my final slide, okay? I believe the future will be a Romans of multiple kingdoms, or many kingdoms. China will be one. EU will be there. US under the leadership of Trump will be, with its legacy, will be another. No one will be as dominant as the USA after the Cold War. When I was studying in the US, I believe, was at the peak. Don't you agree, Rana? At the peak, 1990, winning everything, all top of the world. But that era is gone. So welcome, right? I welcome the era of multiple kingdoms. China will be cautious, homework first. Okay, not being able to explain things very carefully, making things very complicated. And the UK, very special. UK is very special. UK is always a leader in theory, in political, international relations, unique position. So everybody will have to come together to make things happen, this is the future of the world, multipolar world, Romans of many kingdoms. I'm referring to Romans of 3 kingdoms in China, okay, right? So finally, three lines. China has not internally coherent social political system of governance. China's worldview is mostly domestic, mostly economic, mostly respect-centered, rather than expansionary, rather than internationally oriented, interfering. And the third one, the future of the world, most likely, in my view, again, I'm running a risk saying this in front of a historian, okay? Okay. And to me, the most likely the future of the world will be a multipolar system with China not playing the role of today's USA. Nobody can do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Thank you, Dave, very, very much. That was fantastic. So now we do have quite a bit of time for questions. So if I can invite our two speakers, come and join me here. And we have our comrades with microphones, and we will take questions from them.
How would you like us?
Come and take a seat there. Oh, there it is.
Well, you should.
Take up the first question. Tell us who you are first, briefly. Introduce yourself and then ask your question. Adam, we
Can't hear you. Not really.
Okay.
No.
Okay, oh, now it's working, I think.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
So yeah, thank you again. I'm Adham, I'm a PhD in philosophy. So I wanted to ask a brief question on this second line, which bridges the two talks together, specifically about the BRICS, which is kind of a new sort of economic coalition between China and many sort of South-South corporations. And so how do we understand that economic, but also political coalition in line of the slightly more domestic-oriented policy on the one hand? And then sort of the second branch of the question is, how do you think of the BRICS? How do you compare the BRICS with sort of the US involvement in sort of Africa, USA, but also these kind of general US involvement in international investment? So how is the BRICS sort of symmetrical with that, or is it sort of asymmetrical? And what is the unique threat, quote unquote threat, that China poses for people who are afraid of its involvement in these economic coalitions? Yeah, thank you very much again.
Go first. Yeah, sure. Well, very briefly, I mean, David is a global expert on these economic questions, but let me give a very quick thought first. I think that one of the things that the current shutting down of USAID is doing in terms of the way in which international development funding is going to change is that it makes it in some sense more equivalent, because the largest amount of what was given by USAID and also by DFID, which has now been moved into the Foreign Office here in the UK, were development grants. And the majority, I think, of development funding that China has provided over the last 20 years has tended to be loans. So I think that now it's more likely that the US and other private sector actors are going to be moving more into that kind of loan environment. It looks as if, at least for the moment, the large era of all-out grants from the US is going to be much more reduced, even if not removed, from where it is at the moment. The other sense that I have at the moment about the way in which, we talk about the BRI, but actually now that we're moving towards the GDI, the Global Development Initiative, a lot of the concentration, it seems to me, has been changing. 10, 15 years ago, a lot of what China Exim Bank and the other big state development banks did was to hand over large, quite opaque loans that usually had 15-year maturities that were mostly to do with the classic things, airports, highways, roads, and so forth. There's still some of that, but it seems to me a lot of the concentration is first of all now in getting the private sector in China to basically coordinate and operate more. So Huawei, ZTE, and others operating on 5G and communications networks. The second thing I mentioned in my talk, and I bring up again, green energy. I mean, really pushing on solar, wind, and other areas in which green energy transition is something where China is already a very, very dominant player and is likely to continue to embed that advantage. And the third, and the area we haven't mentioned much today, but I'd like to put in there, is the very strong Chinese interest in life sciences development, including thinking about the next pandemic, which I'm sure none of us want, but we all think that one of these days is going to emerge. I think one of the biggest challenges for the Western world is working out in those areas, 5G and similar provision, green energy transition, and life sciences dealing with pandemics, how that kind of wider funding and assistance, and whether it comes through loans or grants, is going to operate. But David will have much more to say about what the Chinese side is doing on this.
Yeah, let me put things in a larger context. You may criticize Karl Marx for many, many, many things, but I think he said one thing which I believe we all agree. In the long run, the economic forces are the foundation for many, many changes. Now, in today's world, the US economy is about 25% of the global economy, which is already exaggerated. If you look at the US economy, much of it comes from lawyers' legal fees, right? Investment banks, I'm serious, investment banks charges, right? Yeah. If you look at the manufacturing, the US economy is just less than one half of China's manufacturing. That's reality. So how can the US carry all the burden of international aid? I knew this when I was a student in the US. When US gave international aid to, say, a country like Poland, let's say out of $1 million, 50% pays to consultants, American consultants, economists, right? Actually, less than 50% goes in actually to the real projects. So that's the reality. That is why Trump is trying to retreat from a lot of international operations. That's the fundamental economic forces. Now, coming back to the other side, China, of course, is rising. Chinese manufacturing is 2 times as big as the US. Shipbuilding, I was mentioning, 70% of the world is still growing. US less than 1%, right? Well, but however, you may think China must be very aggressive, okay, in aligning interests, in aligning countries to push for Chinese interests. The BRICS is a good example to illustrate that you are wrong. I know BRICS very well. I used to be the first chief economist of the BRICS Development Bank, called the new NDB, the New Development Bank, right? You know, China has equal voting rights with Russia, with South Africa, with India. But Chinese GDP is 2 times the sum of the rest of the 4 countries. Think about it. China is super polite. Super polite. I mean, I don't think this is a statement, right? And working at NDB myself as chief economist, I saw firsthand Chinese side wanted several things, or many things, which cannot be properly grounded, implemented. Actually, even better example is AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. UK, actually, very smart, extremely intelligent. I'm sincerely praise UK for geopolitical intelligence. UK was the first country saying that we will join AIIB. US did not. UK the first country, surprising China. But you know, during the war, when the first Russian-Ukraine war, when Crimea was taken, right? 2014? 2014, yep. Right? And AIIB supposedly should continue lending to Russia by design, right? China want to push for its own independent foreign policy, right? You may think China should continue lending to Russia, right? And China has majority shares of AIIB. No way, did not, could not, because Chinese, I don't want to tell, I'm running a risk of telling too much. Simply cannot push its policies through these organizations. So all in point, China is a big country of big Yao Ming, big size, but less powerful. too polite, okay, and too polite and too inarticulate.
It's also worth noting, I think David is quite right, that
Yeah.
in cases, for instance, where Australia's Prime Minister a few years ago made public statements that the Chinese leadership were not very keen on the COVID question, that suddenly there was a massive boycott of Australian goods, despite the chapter agreement that had been signed between China and Australia on that front. China wasn't being so polite to Scott Morrison at that point, was he, as Prime Minister?
I know, that's okay. I think there are issues, there are examples in which China was very strict, was very tough, was very aggressive dealing with some countries. But overall, if you're the bigger picture, overall, China is not able, is not willing, is not able or capable of pushing its agenda on, let's put it this way, on complicated issues. Complicated issues, right? In Confucius used to say, a gentleman is supposed to be, what's the English word? What's the opposite of being articulate? What's the proper word?
Well, sort of taciturn or quiet.
Quiet and clumsy
discreet,
in speaking.
Right.
Okay, better English, okay. A gentleman is supposed to be clumsy in expressing himself. Think of this. It's Confucianism, right? That's a very anti-Western culture. Confucius said, a gentleman should be clumsy in expressing his ideas. That's my education. That's my generation's education. If a kid is too argumentative, the kid is supposed to be a bad kid. Okay, there's a book written by Amartya Sen, right? The name is, you know this book, right? The Argumentative Indians.
The argumentative, yes, indeed.
Which I have a Chinese friend who always uses this book to argue against Chinese. Chinese very bad, not being able to explain, clumsy. Anyway.
Yes, let's find another argumentative member of the audience.
Yes,
another question. There we are. Yes, tell us who you are first.
Hi, my name is Hong Sai. I'm from...
The microphone's just heading to you. There you are.
My name is Zong Shuai. I'm from the Complete Industrial Innovation Policy and as a technology policy analyst. My two questions to Professor Li. The first one is saying that saving is a good thing, but my question is that also a big discussion in China is how to persuade Chinese people to spend this big chunk of money, 40% of GDP. And the second one is you say China is like Yao Ming, dominant size with dominant power, but how China protect himself this kind of dominant size without having a dominant power in the future?
Let me make sure the question is why China?
If China, no, actually, I'm not quite sure what the question is.
Yes,
Okay,
sorry, you'll have to. You're talking about China's a dominant power.
You are a gentleman.
He's a
You
gentleman,
are a
exactly.
gentleman in Confucius' sense.
Not being articulate. Yes.
Yeah, my question is that how...
Here's your microphone. Yes, so
My question is that how China protect his dominant size without having dominant power in the future?
yes, that's an excellent question.
Okay. Very simple answer.
An excellent
China
question.
loses, not being able to protect its interests. No, 2 days. I mean, 1 month, maybe 1 month ago, there's in what's the country? The African country, Niger. Niger.
Yeah, Nigeria or Niger?
Niger. Nigel.
Niger. Yeah.
In Niger, there's military coup, and 3 Chinese investment executives, business executives, were expelled, and millions of US dollar amount of investment were confiscated. This is a real example. China not being able to protect its own interest, and not willing to interfere. No tough action. So you're right. That's the consequence.
Yeah.
but that has to be an unsatisfactory outcome in the long term.
Correct. So in the
Yes.
long term, in the long run, what China is doing in trying to correct this is to advise companies not going into countries with danger. And also, when you go there, be prepared to lose. We're not able to protect you. We will not send our army to protect you. We only send our army to help you to retreat from the country, okay?
First of all, David, I think you must have seen the famous Chinese film Janlang,
Yeah,
The Wolf
yeah.
Warrior, in which actually
Yeah.
the forces do get sent in to rescue the Chinese citizens in
But only
North
rescue,
Africa.
not attacking them.
You have to see number 2. There's a sequel to the film as well. I watch more Chinese movies than you, clearly. Also TV. Huang Biao, fantastic.
Thank you for your question. Let's move on. Another question over here. Yes, gentleman with his hand up. Tell us quickly who you are. Microphone's heading towards you.
Thank you. Is that you can hear me?
Yes.
David Manning, retired diplomat. Could I ask Professor Mitter to speculate a little bit more on some of his scenarios, and in particular, whether he thinks there's a risk of an arms race in East Asia? Do you think that the build-up that you were referring to of Chinese military power, and of course that includes quite swift nuclear build-up, is going to have an impact on Japan and South Korea? And in particular, if they're frightened that the American guarantee disappears, do you think they'll go nuclear? And what consequence would that have? Would China then double down and spend more money still on defense? Or do you think there's a chance that the Chinese would start to think about arms control regimes to try and check what is happening and to save the NPT?
Excellent question. Thank you for that. So I would say, just since we're doing, a great Chinese term that's both part of traditional Chinese language and also Marxist, the 矛盾, the contradiction in this film. And I think one of the contradictions is that one of the greatest issues that actually I think secretly, the Chinese leadership is very glad about is the continuing presence of the United States in East Asia. And secretly, they'll be very worried if there is any sign of the United States actually removing its power from allies in the region, including South Korea, Japan, and also partners like Singapore. Why? Because the withdrawal of American power from East Asia makes the rise of a nuclear arms race in the region much more likely. In circumstances where that all-encompassing American security network, which has built up over 70 or 80 years since World War II in Asia, disappears, South Korea, to name one country, I think is one that's already very publicly, in a way that I think is potentially very dangerous, talking about the risk from North Korea. And as you just said, Chinese authorities say we don't control what goes in North Korea. We have no idea. Maybe in those circumstances, they're going to say, the only answer might be to actually go nuclear. And I hope they don't. And I think that this would be a very dangerous example of proliferation in the region. But it's not impossible. Similarly, Japan, which many people know is very close to nuclear capacity, has not actually exercised it, largely because the continuing power of the US-Japan security alliance is one that has meant it's unnecessary for Japan to actually take that particular route. And once you have lots of medium-sized powers deciding that the only way in which they can keep themselves secure is to maintain nuclear weapons, you have the possibility of escalation. We think about Ukraine. Many people in Ukraine right now, after the two Russian invasions, 2014 and 2022, find themselves wishing they had not signed the Bucharest Agreement of 1994, in which they gave up their nuclear weapons, because with those still there, who knows if Vladimir Putin would still have attacked Ukraine, but the likelihood in the minds of many decision makers is that it would have been much less. So in that sense, I'm going to say something very paradoxical and contradictory, David, that secretly, I think that many people maybe in the top leadership in China actually know that in many ways, the United States' presence in the region, even though of course it comes up against China's desire to have more autonomy and control for its own navy and army in the region, actually is one of the factors that has kept a balance in the region for a very long time. And if that were to be removed, there's no sign yet that that's going to be the case, but if it were to change, then actually, exactly what the gentleman says, the prospect of nuclear proliferation, hardly say it, but still worrying, proliferation in the region would be much greater in many ways.
But Rana, America is, one theory is that it's withdrawing from Europe so it can focus more energy in the Pacific. That's a rather terrifying prospect.
Not for many Asians, I would think. I think most Asians actually regard the fact that China is a major market in the region, has huge markets into which the emerging economies of Southeast Asia can sell. and that the US continues to provide security provision that means that areas like the South China Sea, where obviously China does have the idea of gaining greater control, has to be controlled within issues like the code of conduct rather than simply being taken by force. If you speak to Singaporeans, Indonesians, and Malaysians, the thing that they usually say is don't make us choose, on the grounds that they see the economic benefit of Chinese presence in the region and the security benefit of the United States. I don't think they'd want that changed.
Interesting. So, more questions? Yes. And gentleman right at the end row there with the hand up. There you are. Microphone's coming. Do introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name's Sherrod Cooper-Coles from the China-Britain Business Council, and I got a question for Professor Mitter and one for Professor Lee. For Professor Mitter, it is the fact that there are now said to be some 200,000 Chinese students in the United Kingdom, but only 330 British students in China. And I'd like to ask you about what you think we should be doing to address that imbalance in understanding and curiosity between our two academies. And for Professor Lee, I'd like to ask about a movement. I mean, some of the clowns in the Conservative Party who brought us Brexit also introduced something called the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, under which certain countries would be put on the list, and anyone dealing with those countries or parts of those countries would have to register with the security authorities. And what arguments would you use in saying to the people in the security establishment, the Home Office, the right of the Conservative Party, the Sinophobes, that China should not be put on a list of countries operating malign and covert foreign influence in this country? So 2 questions for 2 professors, the Liang way.
Rana,
can you remember your question?
I do remember the question. Sherrod, great to see you here. I'm very glad you didn't ask me about British politics, because I can say that British politics is very complex and I don't really understand it, whereas Chinese politics, as Professor Lee has pointed out, is quite simple, really, and much easier to interpret. I think that if anyone in this room, and I hope there's no one in this room who doubts the continuing importance of the soft power of this country, of the United Kingdom, looks at the way in which its higher education system is still appreciated and respected around the world. Sometimes with the possible exception of our own country, I have to say, Alan, but even there, I think it's fair to say that the benefits and the real value that the university system in this country brings to the world, as well as our country, is better understood. It's certainly understood in a few places as well as it is in China, where the fact that we have, I think, 200,000 is the number you gave us just there, students who have chosen to spend, quite often the hard-earned money of their middle-class parents, or have, through the rigorous academic study that David was talking about, got scholarships, which are extremely fiercely won, to come and study here in this country, add immeasurably to the wider cosmopolitanism of our system, as well as bringing in a certain number of fees, which is always welcome too. But also, I have to say openly and with great joy, come and understand the many benefits of a highly liberal higher education system, where we hope and insist, I hope, that no subject and no viewpoint is out of bounds or out of the realm of discussion, and where actually the difficult questions, such as the relationship between China and the world, the wider way in which the world is changing, often very fast, can and should be discussed very openly amongst those students, many of whom from China are then going back to China to work in media, to work in business, to work in academia, and bring many of the areas of knowledge and values that they bring from the UK back to China. That doesn't mean for a minute that we're sending them back as mini Brits, wonderful idea that might be. But it does mean that having that exposure to a different sort of culture also helps to shape them in their quest, I think, to be people who serve and understand and improve China, their own country as well. And yes, of course, we should be doing a tremendous amount more than we are at the moment to get scholarships, to get opportunities for British students to go to China and study there. And I would ask, since David is highly influential, making it as easy as possible for British students and other students from the outside world, Americans too, and Europeans, to get to China and study and not face too many obstacles in doing so. That's a really important task for the Chinese government, and I hope that more can be done on that front as well.
Certainly. You asked an extremely important question, and I wish I had an opportunity to be face-to-face with some of our politicians. I would say the following to them, if I had such a chance. I tell them that you have misunderstood China. Fundamentally, you misunderstood China. The reason is that China is not willing and not in a position, not able to influence other countries, interfere in other countries. China is not what you think. China is not trying to influence your election, influence your media, influence your academic research. No, China does not have that position. To the extent that China seems to be aggressive, that's when the leaders in China feel that three core interests are compromised. Okay, number one, the political regime stability. If some of your media, either by intention or by implication, say, oh, the Chinese political system should be changed. Okay, the party should be out. The communists should be out. Okay, then the Chinese authorities are worried. Okay, they worry. They want to fight back. Second issue they care most is about the issue of Taiwan, because again, the Taiwan issue, I would say, is an issue of respect. Because Taiwan has been, both sides at the end of World War II have been saying that, oh, Taiwan, only one China, we should end the century of humiliation by having some kind of unification, we can imagine, you can be super creative in coming up with the unification ways, okay? So if somebody says, oh, Taiwan is to be independent, then the authorities in mainland China are truly offended. They feel being pushed. They have to fight back. The third issue, they worry. If somebody says, okay, Chinese rise is unfair, Chinese technological progress should be stopped. They have stolen technology. They are sending students to UK, to Cambridge, to steal the best technology and then bring back to Tsinghua University, making Tsinghua better than Cambridge. Then they are offended. Okay, so they believe that China has rights to continue rising, continue doing science technology, continue making various innovations for the whole world, right? So I would explain to your politicians, understand China properly, don't make policies based on your misunderstanding of China.
Time for another question? Right. In the corner. Oh, yes, there you are. Zoe, introduce yourself.
To be gender balanced. I mean, were you okay? Well, I know this. We have all gentlemen, no ladies.
Yes.
All right, do you want to ask a question?
Ambassador and gentlemen.
No, we have time for both of you. So it's Gillian, yes.
Okay, Gillian Tett, I'm Provost of King's College in Cambridge. And of course, Rana is a new honorary member. I had a very simple question, which is that the Trump administration seems very obsessed with the idea of trying to peel Russia away from China. Do you think they have any chance of succeeding?
Sure.
So this is what's sometimes called the reverse Nixon strategy, which I call the Noxin for obvious reasons. The idea that by becoming close to Russia, the current US administration can essentially separate Russia from China. I don't think this seems to be very convincing, because in 1972, when Nixon visited China, it was at a time when the Soviet Union, as it then was, and China were in such a bad state that they had almost gone to war with each other in 1969 over the Zhengbao, the Suri River border area. And the two countries, I mean, there wasn't even a full ambassador in China from the Soviet Union, I think between 1967 and 1970, but certainly the relationship was extremely poor. I think today, and this is something David will speak about with more expertise, the relationship below the very top level. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, from all accounts, have a sort of genuinely quite friendly relationship. I haven't been listening to their calls, I hasten to add, but this is what people tend to say. But below that level, when it comes to think tankers, analysts and others, I think, the Chinese and Russians are prepared to work with each other, but they're not always on the same page. And there are some areas like the Arctic where actually the interests of the two don't always coincide together. But that having been said, there are so many areas that have built up together in terms of that relationship. The fact that there's, is and always will be the thousands of miles of border, the technological cooperation, particularly since, China has not been selling arms to Russia for the Ukraine war, but it's certainly been providing technology that has underpinned much of the drone and other technology that Russia has used against Ukraine. There's obviously economic cooperation on fossil fuels and other areas too. And in general, a sense that both Moscow and Beijing feel that while they don't share a worldview on everything, their backs are against the wall when they want to kind of stare Washington in the eye. So for all those reasons, added to the fact that they realize that even if the current president of the United States wants to get closer to Russia, he'll be gone in 4 years' time and someone else will be president and this may not last. That seems to me not a recipe for a fundamental shift. So the reverse Nixon idea seems to me, David, not to really be one that actually has the capacity to last. But what do you think?
It's true. On this issue, I fully agree with you. Okay, think from the Chinese perspective. Okay, China has no other alternatives than being peaceful, being friendly with Russia. The two countries share, I think, the longest land border of all countries in the world. And the Russian side worries quite a bit about China, because Russia, I think again, oftentimes Russian people wrongly believe that China will find ways, one way or the other, to take back some of the territories. You know this very well.
Siberia.
The Siberia part.
Yeah.
But I do not think that is the intention of China. China has no ambition, no capacity to ask the land back. Okay. But for China, Russia if Russia is unfriendly with China, there might be issues, might be many issues, right? Because we're such close neighbors.
Could I ask one very specific,
Sure.
comes from, because it's so interesting to me and I don't know the answer. What do the kind of leading Chinese think about Russia using North Korean troops in Ukraine? Do they think it's a good idea? Do you think it's a good idea?
No, I think most people believe, I be careful. Most people in my community, China is a complicated society, right? The educated community, think of this as a joke. The Koreans are sending their unprepared soldiers to Ukraine to fight for Russia, for money, right? For money, right? I should say, people believe it's a very sad situation, right? So people, in China, the Ukraine crisis is a very dividing issue among friends. Friends don't usually, are very careful not discussing this issue. There are people who are pro-Russia. There are people who are pro the U.S. On the Ukraine issue, they show their preference. Okay, people can argue with each other. It's more than this, much more present to discuss Premier League, right? Yeah.
Tremendous. Now, Zoe,
yes.
ask us your question and
Thank
tell us
you.
who you are. Yes.
Yes, my name is Zoe Strimple. I write for The Telegraph and assorted other outlets. Thank you both for very engaging talks. The one thing that really struck, well, not the one thing that really struck me was not a surprise to see very few images of women in any slides, which is, as I say, not surprising. But Rana, just to your point about the kind of the emergence of these hybrid semi-authoritarian regimes around the world, and you mentioned Turkey, India, places like that, and obviously China. It does seem that with the emphasis on STEM and engineering and so forth, the sort of one potential feminist utopia, which might have really powerful STEM women kind of running the show and having seats at those sorts of tables, it doesn't seem to be at least obvious. With this emerging global order, with the emphasis on quite macho states and until now for no good reason, but still quite macho fields, is there potentially a cap on how far these nations can go with that agenda? Because, up to half the population is perhaps not part of those conversations or those the cultural norm to push that. I may be wrong in China's case, but it just seems like that's quite a big portion of all of those populations that won't be mobilized in the way that seems fundamental to both of your visions of how the future is going to look with China in the ascendant.
Well, thanks very much, though, and you were quite right to raise the question of gender, which I don't think either of us had very explicitly in our talk, so point taken and made. I'll note actually that I talked a bit about social media, and one of the big movements, 4 or 5 years ago in Chinese social media, many of you will know, was the so-called rice rabbit movement or rice bunny movement, which transliterated directly into Chinese, of course, is Me Too. In other words, the famous Me Too movement that made its way onto Chinese social media exactly as a means of mobilizing, mostly women, not entirely women, on Chinese social media against the ingrained sexism that they saw in society. And this is a longer history. I actually remember reading the memoir, the Huilu, of one of the, I think it was Kan Keqing, or one of the kind of senior women in the CCP, who talked about her husband's, I think the phrase she used was 大男子主义, kind of massive hyper-masculinity, as a way that the Chinese Communist Party went back to this sort of unshaven, revolutionary idea of what manhood was supposed to be. And even more recently, actually, this pushback against seemingly effeminate young men on social media, Korean boy bands and so forth. They were seen to moisturize too much, and this rather rude expression, yang pao, being used of sissy boys. So the masculinity of the revolution is now being pushed back, I think, in people's faces. I think you're right, though, that in a country where there is a 50%, 50% of the population are also in the labor force, that needs to be seen as an important part of the future. And I turn to one other media production, which was a huge hit in China 4 years ago, another TV show, always Chinese TV shows, 32if you've that one, Nothing But 30, about 30-something Shanghai women, and the way in which they push back against the constraints of society. That series got, if I got it rightly, 78 billion mentions on Weibo. I mean, there were huge numbers of people around the country talking about that as an expression of that wider need to use feminist ideas to reshape a changing gendered labor market, society, financial stability. All of these are hugely gendered issues in China. The next time we both come and do a lecture, we'll talk about them in more detail.
Yeah, they are complicated forces shaping the relative status of women in China. Okay, let's list at least two. Okay, number one is market forces. Market forces in many cases are helping women, especially uneducated women. Uneducated women are actually earning better income than men in most cases. In most cases, in the UK, I'm sure, nannies, or what do you call it,
childminders.
Nannies and domestic helpers are earning higher income than oftentimes their husbands. They are high demand. So this is one issue. There are many ladies are thinking why we are making so much money while our boyfriends, husbands are just consuming, right? Just consuming and become so lazy. So they are revolting. This is market force, okay? Meanwhile, another phenomenon is also coming up. For higher positions, for the business executives, men are still favored by market force because they drink. They drink better than women, but not drink. Okay, women can drink better than men. Okay, however, it's more socially acceptable for two men to get drunk and then to forge a deal. But it's strange for a men and women business executives to get drunk and forge a deal. Not impossible, but it's very rare. So therefore, career-wise, for senior, for business, for high positions, women are disadvantaged, especially in the case of childbearing. Where in China we have a saying, having one child making you become dumb by 3 years. Is that what proper English? Please, you help me.
I'll take the fifth on that one, I think, as they...
If you have a child, you regress in your intelligence, IQ, by 3 years.
I don't think many women use this expression, David, do they?
No,
Probably said by men.
they told me this. They told me this because they stand up in night feeding the baby. They're losing memory. This is the Chinese ladies' popular saying. They don't want to have babies. Having one baby making them IQ regress by 3 years. Okay, this is I'm just poor translation. Poor translation.
I think this is the mythology rather than the reality we hasten to add.
Of course, it's popular saying. Okay, popular saying. Well, in politics, China used to have a policy to explicitly promote women, which for some reason is no longer so much emphasized. Actually, Mao Zedong is very progressive, very, very progressive. Mao Zedong respected his mom much more than his father. So Mao Zedong came up with the saying, women holds up half the sky, right?
True.
Half the sky. This is popular.
That is true, although he wasn't so respectful to 3 of his 4 wives, to be fair, David.
You may argue he is too respectful for his last wife. To his last wife.
Yes, not enough to hurt
Creating
and
political trouble.
Yang Kai-hui.
Yeah, but it's a complicated issue. But truly, Mao Zedong is proactive, ahead of his times.
Well, one 15-second thing off the back of that, just say, there's a lot of couples also in China where the husband takes a lower-paid, very stable government job, because unlike the United States at the moment, working for the national government is a very secure job. And then the wife will often go into Xiahai, will go into private enterprise, and may find herself actually earning a lot more in those terms. But because the men tend to get favored for the government jobs, it's safer in that sense for him in the couple to take that particular position. But that has to do with the kind of sociology of employment in China, which should change over time.
Tremendous. Gentlemen, I think we need to call the evening to halt there. Our constraint is a chef on a very short fuse on the other side of the road. So shall we thank our speakers again very warmly for an amazing evening. Thank you so much.
We have books exchange. Oh, we exchange books.
Yes.
I signed a copy of my book for President Short.
Quite right, and we should do the same here and get a picture of it too. Alan, if you want to...
Very
Do
good.
hand up, we'll
Splendid.
all together.
We take photograph in the middle. In the middle, right? In the middle, right? We have photograph. Oh, we have iPhone, right?
Here's our photograph. Excellent. There you are.
Yeah.
So this is
for
you with
yeah,
my
that's right. That's right.
deep respect.
Hold your
There.
book. Yeah. Yeah.
Catherine?
Good. Great.
I'll just ask Catherine.
Yes, of course.
There we are.
There.
You've done it? Yeah.
Great.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful evening.
David. That's lively in every way.
It was a great evening.
Air, comfort, and climate. Wonderful.
My pleasure. Well, let's go and have a
Let's do that, George. Sign this over to you as
very
well.
wonderful. Thank you so much for this.
You're most welcome.